Oh, I need to get my notes out.
And we are live Energy Week podcast. Ryan Ray alongside the good doctor herself, Dr. Ellen Wald. Miss Wald, it's a rainy day over here in Texas. How is it in Florida?
Rainy. It's like paradise here. The weather could not be nicer. It's like 80 degrees, low humidity. I don't know, a nice breeze. This is not May. I don't know what happened. Clearly, it's supposed to be like 90 degrees with at least 75% humidity and no breeze. So I think it's clearly climate change. The world is coming to an end. Prepare for the apocalypse.
I wondered how much, so I went fishing a few weekends ago, and the fisher, our guide, he told us that the fish were kind of slow. We call them fish, but the way the season bonding all it works has been pushed back because of the winter storm. And I've thought about that a lot because it is unseasonably cold here in Texas, and so I wonder if that's part of why we're having this cold May. I'm not complaining because I'm sure July and August will still be hot, but it is nice and cool here in the great state of Texas.
Yeah.
We've got enough rain though for this is the problem. Like you get so much rain, you're like, okay, we've got enough rain, but July and August, you're like, oh, rain just one day. So I'm not gonna complain about the rain. I will take the rain whenever we can get it. So anyways, let me see here. Let me send out this tweet. Let everybody know that we are now live. And there we go. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, we had an interesting debate this morning on the Text One Guest podcast. I say debate, discussion. Curious your thoughts. Oil prices are. I checked this afternoon, but 65 Brent, 63 WTI, 61 WTI, something like that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, 60. Okay, okay, no, it's done climbed. 66 WTI, 69 Brent. Okay, so you have these high prices, and you have the Colonial gas price deal that happened last week, which is gasoline. But yeah, WTI 66. Thanks, Man United. And the debate I've seen is that some people in the oil and gas industry are starting to blame Biden for some of these prices, and we've kind of talked about this some. But has he helped prices as well? In other words, if you remember during the Trump administration, some oil and gas folks were upset with some of his policies, especially asking the Saudis to increase production, stuff like that. So, has Biden been good for oil prices?
I think it depends who you are, but because if you're a consumer,
Right.
then I mean, consumers are like, first of all, the president is always going to get blamed for high gas prices, no
Mhm,
matter what.
mhm.
So, when gasoline prices were, I mean, now I think the national average is above $3 a gallon, and they're like, it has been this high since 2014, and so obviously they're blaming Biden for that, and inflation is part of that, obviously.
Mhm.
But if you're an oil company, if you're a fairly large oil company in the US now, I think you've got to be okay. I think you're okay. See, I think that they're happy about the prices, but I don't think that they think that Biden is responsible for these prices. They're in I think it's mostly OPEC themselves and rising demand, which Biden is not particularly responsible for.
Mhm.
That's just like that's the way things are going to go. This pandemic was going to come to an end. Everyone thought, demand was going to rise or go back at least to at least most of where it was. So I don't, and if you look, at response, I think that oil companies are probably I think it depends who you are. If you're a company that's well positioned, that doesn't need federal leasing
Mhm.
to expand, and you've got, you know where you're going to expand when you're ready or you want to, and you're happy to kind of sit tight and, you know, um, pay off your debts right now, then you're happy. But I don't know if you can really attribute that to Biden. If you're an oil company that's stuck without leases, then you have got to be hopping mad at the Biden administration because you can't you're stuck in like federal leasing purgatory, essentially. So
Right, and if you're also positioned to handle upcoming regulations and stuff like that, bigger
yeah,
picture. So,
yeah,
listen,
especially methane regulations because those are coming back.
I'm curious, what would Trump be saying about OPEC and Russia right
Oh my God. Yeah. So OPEC would be like,
now?
Oh yeah, I mean, we would have had like Trump tweets like OPEC needs to pump. Like, remember when the Indian minister was like, "You have to pump more oil,"
Mhm, mhm.
and back and was like, it was like basically the Saudis like, we want more," and then Saudi minister was like, "No." It would be like that, except that I think that they would probably be listening. He would be like, "Gas prices are too high. OPEC is responsible. OPEC and Russia, you know." Although I think that we'd also see higher production in the US because I think that the regulatory uncertainty and the rhetoric from the Biden administration is keeping oil companies from they don't feel comfortable expanding. So I think that we would have higher production in the US and the oil patch, there'd be a lot more employment and employment would have picked back up. And so I think that, you know, they might not even be as high because there'd be more
Right.
US production,
Yeah.
which might not be better in the long run for the health of oil companies, but we'd be producing more. I mean,
Yeah,
if you look at the report, it says we're a net oil importer right now. And I
right,
don't think Trump would stand for that. I think he'd be hopping mad about that.
right. It's kinda weird because, if the prices are high, of course, we're not I hadn't looked at the rig count lately, I don't know where it's at, I can pull it up real
I
quick.
can tell you, it's been like steadily climbing
Right.
mostly, but like in not like very large increments.
Yes, it's up 5, 453, and that
Okay,
was up 114 from last year,
that's like a big jump, up 5.
up 5. Yeah, and so, yeah, you have the higher prices. I think a lot of the factors that you're pointing to, obviously are contributing. And then, we're about to hit summer demand, and so that should see the demand numbers keep it on. It's just funny because this kind of the secret truth about oil and gas is like the workers, they like $5 gasoline because that means they get to stay employed, right? As long as it's not like tax driven. They like $5 gasoline because that means they got jobs. And so it's kind of weird though. The normal consumer hates $5 gasoline because it costs them a lot of money. And so it's just been kind of funny to watch the kind of battle over how do you take responsibility or who do you blame. Okay. Anyways, let's get on to it. Blackouts threaten entire U.S. West this summer as heat awaits. Let me tell you something. I think I told you on the show a few weeks back. ERCOT sent out a warning that they were in trouble back in like mid-April. Did you see that?
Um, no, I did
Yes,
not.
yes. So they went under emergency status like on a nice San Diego day here in Texas. So well, it might not
Ooh,
be the West. It might be Texas that has to worry about
wow.
about it. Yeah,
Are they counting Texas as part of the West?
no, I'm just saying I'm just saying right now I am okay, here it is. This is alert. This is April 13th. Um Due to a combination of high gen outages typical in April and higher than forecasted demand caused by a stall cold front over Texas, ERCOT may enter emergency conditions.
Oh
We do not
no.
expect customer outages. Declaring an emergency would allow us to access additional resources. So that's on April 13th. I mean, what do you think
Wow.
August 13th is going to bring for us?
Well, won't you have all that wind power going for you?
It better be.
Aren't there like big winds in Texas? I don't know. They're always saying how like in the summer the I don't
Yeah,
know, they always
winds.
have more. It's like powering all of Texas is being powered from wind,
Mm.
which is obviously not true, but
So blackouts
Um,
the entire West. What do
well,
you think?
here's what's interesting because I remember reading, okay, so it says states are shuttering coal and gas power plants, aren't replacing them fast enough to keep pace with vagaries of an unstable climate. It's not an unstable climate. I hate the way they're like, it's the unstable climate causing, no, it's the people. The people. Like, okay, I'm sorry, it's the people who are causing the demand for power. The climate isn't like doing anything. Like, yeah, they're going to be they're trying to blame it on like wildfires. I keep wanting to say wildflowers. Not a thing that causes blackouts. Wildfires. Yeah, it's in so okay. They're like taking all of the like problems and like mushing them all together in this art. It's like, so states are shuttering coal and gas power plants and not replacing them fast enough. That's a problem because you're getting rid of the things that produce the power, and your power demand is either constant or growing. So that's one thing. But then talking about like, but they're not replacing them fast enough to keep pace with the vagaries of an unstable climate and the region's existing power structure is woefully vulnerable to wildflowers, drought, and heat waves. Okay, fine. But do you know where actually they get a lot of power from, like when they need it? They get it from Wyoming's coal power plants.
Well,
So
we don't
I'm
all live in San
sorry.
Diego, and so I mean, right, we don't all live in San Diego. It's not as if we can live in this environment where it's 68 degrees or 72 degrees year round, right? And so,
I know. That's what, like, I feel like we have San Diego weather right now in North Florida, and it's gonna end in like 3 days, 2 days. But yeah, I could see why people live in San Diego now.
yeah, oh, I've thought about it quite often. Then you look at the real estate, you're like,
And you're like, no, it's not a place where you can actually live.
no, you can't afford it.
You
But
could
if you
like
could,
camp in a
yes,
tent.
yeah, I've told my wife that I've considered going and like working on a fishing boat and just sleep on the dock every night because perfect weather. Um, but yeah, it's funny because where we're at now is if you have a cold snap or a hot summer or a long winter or a short whatever, like it's the rapidly changing climate. It's like, guys, I mean, we've been around for a little while now. Surely we know that, we it's weather is not a clock, right? It doesn't, it's not like on October 3rd, the temperature drops 3 degrees every year. Like that's and then October
Yeah.
4th, that's not how it works. Sometimes it's a little bit later, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes it gets cooler earlier, then it warms back up. We have the El Ninos, La Ninas, but it's a little frustrating now that we're always kind of reacting um, to these things as if
Yeah, it's like they expect if it's not like the exact average temperature, then there's a problem and it's caused by climate change. It's like if you haven't if you're like outside of like exactly what the average temperature, and they don't realize like average temperature doesn't mean the mean temperature that like it always is. It's an average, which means you've got plenty below and plenty above, and that's how you get the average. But apparently they were asleep in like fourth grade or third grade or whenever you learn averages.
yes.
So, but I mean, I think that it's like I mean, clearly it's an issue in the West. Apparently Sweden is also bracing for power outages. They are curbing electricity exports after nuclear retirements have left the country with too little spare capacity.
What say that again? After what? What happened?
Yeah, they closed their nuclear plants.
Oh man.
I mean, the answer is obviously don't shut down the old plants until you have reliable replacements.
Did you
That's
see
clearly the issue, not climate change. But they want to just blame it on climate change.
Did you see the article last week that was complaining about how much land oil wells have used in North America?
No. How much
Yeah.
land have or and can we compare that to how much land we'd have to use for, like, wind and solar farms? Because 'Cause
Okay.
it'd be,
Yeah.
like, all of
Yeah.
America.
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but basically we did it on the show pretty quick. And so if you took almost not quite the northern half of Louisiana, that's all of the square kilometers that they attributed to well pads. Okay.
Hmm.
Now,
That's not that much, right?
that's not much, right? Louisiana's not that big state. Now, I think solar had accounted for a third of that. Now, what's the fundamental difference between solar and oil wells? Oil wells have been around for how long? And how long has
Since,
solar
like, the
farms been around for?
1800s, come on.
Right. And so, right. But think about that. So solar farms have really caught steam over the last 10, 20 years, right? And they're already
Mhm.
a third of what oil and gas wells are. It's like, guys, don't you see you're gonna blow past oil and gas like at this
Because
rate?
you need because a hydrocarbon is like the perfect it's like the perfect thing for energy. You burn it and it gives you so much more energy than you can create with the solar. If someone could make a solar panel that could match the hydrocarbon in terms of energy produced, then I think we almost wouldn't care about the intermittency issue because you'd be producing so actual like you could actually if you could actually match the amount of energy that would be a major breakthrough. I think
Yeah.
that would be like an actual like what's the word, paradigm changing breakthrough.
Okay, speaking of solar panels are key to Biden's energy plan, but the global supply chain may rely on forced labor from China. Let me
May
just
I like the May.
may may maybe let me just point this out. Is it just me, or have you noticed that the mainstream media all of a sudden, since Trump has left, has started talking about the naughty stuff that China does?
Yeah.
It's really
No.
weird. It's really weird because, like, 3 months and a day ago, or whatever it is, 4 months and a day ago, they weren't doing anything bad. Now all of a sudden, it's like, well, we've got to talk about these forced labor camps in Xinjiang province, and you know,
As if it hadn't been going on for 5+ years
yeah,
or
right,
more.
right. It's utter insanity. Oh, it's so frustrating. It's utter insanity.
There was a report published on Friday from the Helena Kennedy Center for International Justice entitled In Broad Daylight, which is like, oh, that's so perfect. Whoever came up with that must be like patting themselves on the back. In broad daylight.
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Uyghur forced labor and global solar supply chains. I think they get like +10 for the first part of that title and like -5
Yeah.
for the last because it's too
Right.
hard to say.
Right. Well, in the Uyghur issue, to human right advocacy groups, there was plenty of them talking about it during the Trump administration. It just wasn't getting the boost from the
No,
mainstream.
because apparently Trump was like worse
Well,
in their
obviously,
minds.
obviously. I mean, come on. Have you seen his hair? Yeah. You forget his tweets. Good night.
Yeah.
Um. So, but this issue with the solar panels kind of goes to the crux of the environmental debate, right? Which is
Mhm.
you have environmentalists, and I'm not saying that they're all ill-willed. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that we can't find a common ground. But what I'm saying is that the message that they promote and the way they promote their message, it's so um, oblivious to some of the problems with their industry.
Can we just talk about how they said they may be created with dirty coal and forced labor? What's the worst problem? The dirty coal or the forced labor? The enslavement of people or the dirty coal?
Wow.
Oh, I made Ryan choke. That was so bad. I made him choke.
Oh,
Yeah, it was interesting. So I think maybe I've talked about this before. I was once listening to a like webinar thing where it was a panel and they had like a bunch. It was all about the Pennsylvania region, which is where I'm from. So I was kind of interested to hear it. And they had someone like from a natural gas, like kind of group or whatever, because they do a lot of natural gas, the fracking around there. They had someone from a coal, like not like a coal industry group. They had a solar panel and like a person it's not like he doesn't do the installation himself, but he like has a company that does rooftop solar panel installations and I don't know some other people. And so they were on this panel. They were all talking about like how they can because the Pennsylvania region still gets a lot of energy from coal, and they were talking about like shifts and whatever. And the guy who does the solar panels was saying, look, we offer people he's like, we offer them like Chinese solar panels or American made solar panels. And he's like, 9 times out of 10, they will choose the cheaper China ones, even though they know that they're made with like forced labor and bad stuff and all that. They will choose that because it's cheaper. So, I mean, I think that like points. I mean, that's the kind of things that people need. They're like, oh, well, we'll build it in America. Well, that doesn't mean that people will choose them because consumers are going to make the choices that they want. So, what does that mean? Either we have to put big tariffs on the
mhm,
panels from China so
mhm.
that they're not actually cheaper than the American-made ones, or we have to actually do something about products that are made using forced labor. And it doesn't just apply to solar panels, it applies to Nike. I mean, there's like a whole list of like companies that all have factories in that region and are quite possibly, fairly likely, some sort of slave labor / human rights violations going on. So
They're not. Listen, let's put it like this: the fight for 15 is not going on in Xinjiang province right now, and so they're not getting that $15 hour minimum wage. Okay, speaking of hypocrisy from Joe here, please point out the irony of a political party that vilifies the wealth of big oil and then elects a man to high office who immediately puts regulations into play, which ensures that said big oil will profit as it never has before. in this country.
Yeah, basically. Thank you for like, yeah, I mean, obviously, but well, what's interesting, and I've been thinking about this for a while, we have this interesting kind of political realignment going on, or maybe has already happened in the United States, where it used to be that like the Republicans were the party of big business, right? Like, I mean, I'm assuming that big business always gave donations to both parties, but they were sort of seen as this party that like protected the interests of big business, and that's really shifted. I think a lot, not just I mean, especially in the past year. Suddenly, like big businesses all over, like we're not giving any money to Republicans anymore. We're all like so like what the Democrats are now like like all these companies have to do is say like Texas has bad voting laws and just like come out and make that statement and suddenly the Democrats are gonna like be their defenders. And it's interesting because sorry if I'm like getting way too political, but I think that we've seen that happen in tech. We've seen it happen with like say like Coca-Cola and airlines. To think that that's not going to happen in the energy industry is, I think, naive.
Well, you're a historian here, right? So here is a history question that you could ponder on after this podcast is over. This is Ryan's 10 full hat theory time. Okay, the hat's on. If you go back into history, the last decade or so, we had a movement you might remember called Occupy Wall Street.
Oh, so you didn't want me to like go way back in history?
Not that far back. Not that far. Yes, that's close.
Okay.
Okay, that might tie in at some point. We had Occupy Wall Street. In Occupy Wall Street, whatever you want to say about them, they were close to what was going on. They weren't right, but they were knocking on one or two rungs below the right door. And given time, maybe they would have figured out what's actually happening and pointed their vitriol towards the right people. Suddenly, after that, what happened? A lot of the current political narratives that we're now fighting over as a country became the talking points of all these big corporations and all the mainstream media. And so, just maybe, to your point about big business aligning with the left and historically they did the right, maybe there is something to the fact that folks on the left who are disenfranchised almost figured out what was going on, and they're trying to buy them off by shifting the agenda. Just maybe.
Just maybe. I mean, it's interesting though to think back to Occupy Wall Street. So I'm remembering back to Occupy Wall Street, and I was in grad school. I was like finishing up my dissertation around
Mhm.
then, and I remember going to a conference. It was actually like a foreign policy-ish conference,
Mhm.
but actually no, this was no, I went to the big historians conference, and this guy was giving a talk, and I went to his talk, and he was talking about like new trends or whatever in history, and I asked, I was like, what about like he like mentioned, business and economics. I talked to him and I raised my hand. I had a question, and we were talking about this, and he was like, "This is like the huge thing. We need to have more focus on economic history and business history to understand like what's happening." And so we talked about it, and he was like super like it was like Occupy Wall Street had somehow like totally shifted his ideas about like history. And I was
Mhm.
like, Occupy Wall Street is like one thing that like there is like a lot of like business and economic history. Like it is actually like a thing that is important. But he was like super focused on Occupy Wall Street. And I think now that and that was like literally like right after it had happened. I think they
Mhm.
just like cleared away the area.
Mhm.
Funny story. So I used to read the New York Times wedding section like religiously, and there was like a year or something after they were like there was this what like the big featured wedding was like two people who had met
Yeah.
in Occupy Wall Street. Like they met while they were occupying Wall, and like a year later they had like some like fancy wedding, and I was like, they definitely like sold out because
Yeah.
like like
Yeah.
how else do you get in the New York Times wedding section?
Right. Right.
so so I think part of that happened to Occupy Wall Street was like part of these people just sold out.
Yeah.
um, but then like you've like the Tea Party. So I think like you had Occupy Wall Street on, and then you had Tea Party on, and it was like one side is
Mhm.
this, one side is that, and then somehow this like Trump movement subsumed like
Mhm.
parts of it because there's still that anti-Wall Street like
Mhm.
thing, and but the Democrats have none of that. Like
Mhm.
where is the like anti-Wall Street thing? It's all like the only like thread of that's left is like Elizabeth Warren sometimes like stands up and is like bad bankers.
Between her speeches for the bankers.
And like, that's it. Where did that go? I think people are still angry at Wall Street, and they're only going to get more angry as inflation gets worse, even if
Yes.
it's not their fault.
Well, and it's hard to kind of talk about, these policies impacting oil and gas companies or energy companies. And I think this is what, in the energy business you have to be cautious of is if you're looking at, Disney as a bastion of morality, and then you look at kind of how they handle overseas business, or you look at Nike or whomever, it's quite obvious that these companies are pandering wherever they are. And so before you take your energy policy advice from them, you might want to take a step back. Okay, here we go. Here he is, the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Dean Foreman. How's it going, sir?
Going great. How are you?
Doing wonderful. How is the weather up in DC? It's been unseasonably cold down here in Texas. I guess that cold snap is still lingering around.
It's gone back and forth. It's a little overcast, a little rainy, and lots of those cicadas around.
It's cicada season. Oh my God, Brood X. Sorry, so the year I graduated college in Princeton was 2004, was the year that Brood X emerged from the ground. And my memories of that time will always be tainted by giant blind cicadas flying into everything, being scrunched underfoot. In fact, when I packed up my car and drove back to Philadelphia, guess what came out as I unpacked it? A cicada. I was totally disgusted. Sorry. So I remember that, and I feel your pain, and I am so not jealous.
Just have to make it a few more weeks, I think.
Okay. So let's get into the monthly statistical report, which will be out on this Thursday, May the 20th. Okay, let me ask you, could you summarize this by saying demand is back? Almost back? Close to being back? How would you summarize it?
I'd say it's made progress. It's not completely back, but a couple of benchmarks worth mentioning. The first is that, from a total perspective, 19.6 million barrels per day for the month. That's pretty phenomenal. So that's up 2.5% from March, and it's within 3.5% of its level from April 2019. So we're not even doing year-on-year comparisons at this point, because a year ago, we're in the middle of a pandemic. But back 2019 was pretty phenomenal because that was one of the stronger months in 11 years. In fact, it was the highest for April for gasoline, pretty much on record. And gasoline demand led the recovery last month. So it is showing a lot of resilience in terms of transportation. I think we've got some challenges on the supply side and the trade side. That also popped out last month.
Let's talk about crude oil production real quick. We are, if you look at the 5-year range, we're, I guess, above the 50 percentile mark, roughly in there. It's not as bad as you might think. It's maybe not as good as some would hope for. What's kind of your read on it? It's rebounded some, but it looks like it's leveled off now. Is that a good assessment of what's going on?
For which concept? Just demand or for all of them?
For the production, crude oil production.
Well, for production, it's a combination of our data and EIA's on that. And, we've been watching each month through this year so far, where the production has wavered between 10.5 and 11 million barrels per day for crude oil, a little north of 5 million barrels per day for natural gas liquids. And it's just sort of cruised along despite the fact that we've had this structural downturn in the amount of drilling. The drilling is still, even with 65 and 70 today, almost $70 Brent crude oil. Despite that, the drilling is remarkably and historically low. So this has a lot of ramifications, but both for EIA's outlook, in the way we interpret our own data, we noticed in this week's, now this is not in the April data or report, but in this week's EIA weekly petroleum status report, there was a 1 million barrel per day downgrade of natural gas liquids. To go from low fives to low fours is a big change. And it turns out, as we talk to them, that they've actually had data on this since around February, and now they're starting to reflect it. So we're going to see some changes, and we will next month reflect that. I don't know that there's anything like that changes on the crude oil side, but at least directionally, what it tells us is that there have been more supply pressures than may be evident in the data per se, based on it just reflecting the fact that we've had this lower drilling activity. So look, this is the way real data are made. You do the surveys, you estimate to fill in the holes, you come up with the best estimates you can, and retroactively there may be some things that get changed along the way, and that's what we're seeing in the EIA data on that side of it. But right now, if the expectation is for the next 2 years, through end of 2022, that we're going to have this record amount of oil demand growth globally, that in EIA's expectation that the US should participate in increasing production and supplying about 30% of that growth. Well, that 30% of that growth depends critically on the US being able to step up and drill to produce it. And right now, and this can change based on the price environment, but right now, as we look out the window, the drilling activity is really not picking up markedly, despite the fact that prices have been strong. Whether you want to call that capital discipline on the behalf of the companies or structural damage to the industry, where it's just really hard to change on a dime and redeploy rigs and crews. One executive put it very nicely. They said, if they want to expand beyond their current budget, they're people limited. They'd have to go and find and rehire, and it's not as easy as it sounds. So there you are. The responsiveness of drilling and rigs to the current price appears to be less than it historically has been, at least for the last few years.
So those 114 up 114 rigs over a year is not the number to be looking at. No, I'll give you a hard time because we were talking about it earlier. It's like we're up 114 rigs year over year. It's like, yeah, that doesn't, compared to last year, as you say, we almost need like the year over year stats to kind of look at and go, wow. And then we need like the 2 year over year, whatever that would be, to kind of go back to 2019 to kind of get a real comparison, because it's so crazy. You look at that and go, you're up 114 rigs and we're still probably down a ton since 2019. So it's kind of a weird spot we're in with the data right now.
You've got it. And that combination, by the way, of demand and the economy coming back, that part, check. I think that's good. And there is a caveat to it that I'll come back to in a sec. But with that, coupled with relatively flat supply, the U.S. is a net importer again. And that's the issue. EIA expects that to hold for this year and for next. So we're importing more. We're a net petroleum importer after having reached that big milestone back in 2020 for first time on an annual basis in 62 years.
Yeah, I was actually looking at that right now, and wondering if you could expand on that. So for 2 months now, we've been a net oil importer, but I was kind of thinking about that in term and also kind of looking at that along with our refinery throughput. It says refinery throughput was 15.5 million barrels per day in April, which is actually an increase of 6.6% from March, which is probably like, I mean, maybe you could say that seems about right seasonally. So maybe you can elaborate on that. But we're still 7.2% below its April 2019 level. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, unpack that for us.
So refining activity has been anticipating stronger demand. It's been coming back. It's not back to the healthy levels that we had in the low 90% range back in 2019, but it's substantially up from where it was during the pandemic and the worst of the crisis last year. The challenge there is the activity levels coming back. It's poised to meet demand. The inventories are ample. In fact, going into the Colonial Pipeline outage this last week, the inventories were actually in pretty good shape, despite the fact that you took one major conduit out and you saw a lot of panic buying and consumer reactions. And we'll see what our data show after this next week. But what was interesting, actually, with the latest weekly data on top of this monthly perspective, was that as refining has continued to come back, EIA's latest weekly data showed a 2.3 million barrel per day drop in exports. So, and this is before the outage of Colonial Pipeline. So that was data through the first week of May. And what this is telling us is basically that the trade side of this, building on this, even though refiners are gearing up and the demand is there domestically, we have to watch very carefully as we go through May for what this means both for summer driving season as well as for prospective exports of refined products.
Yeah, so I thought that was really, but one of the things I was wondering is, is the closure of the Philadelphia refinery have any impact on our ability to compare these statistics year on year? Because we probably have less total refining capacity now than we had. So should we be aware of that change?
Well, the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery, which caught fire and has been out of service, that took about 300,000 barrels per day of capacity out. There were other refining expansions in the U.S. that help offset that. And net, I would say the system has adapted and healed pretty well as a result of that. At the time it went out, I mean, it was famous for jet fuel in particular. So, and through the pandemic, that's been in less demand. So, again, things have adjusted largely without it. Going through
Couldn't
this,
have happened at a more perfect time, could it?
well, it didn't seem that way at the time, obviously, but
Maybe you could, that leads us into a discussion about jet fuel. So interesting. So jet fuel deliveries were up 7.7% in April from March, but we're still 31.2% below the April 2019 level. So, but as you said before, it seems like refineries have shifted to producing a lot less jet fuel. So,
Yes.
what are the thoughts? I mean, do people I think jet fuel is like one of the big issues, and one of our listeners points out that United Airlines is adding 400 daily flights for July. But my question is, these are probably mostly domestic flights, I'm guessing, and what's the continued impact of not having a lot of international travel, which eats up a lot of jet fuel? Maybe are we looking at some kind of structural change here in jet fuel use and production?
It's certainly possible. We don't predict it exactly, but if you're 30% down compared to 2019, more than 31, um, obviously there's something structural that's changed along the way. We are seeing a lot more virtual technology used for meetings. A lot of businesses have not resumed in-person meetings yet. They may, and we anticipate, like in the DC area, things are opening back up. And within coming months, things should normalize to a large extent. Travel will normalize somewhat, but I don't know if all conferences will be in person given the pattern of doing things virtually. International travel is probably lagging behind just based on the pace of vaccinations and the pandemic globally. I think you're right that you are adding a lot of domestic flights back. We will see measured progress continuing. I did a presentation a couple of weeks ago to Airlines for America, one of the airline trade associations here in DC, and the discussion there is really, with the industry. In the pandemic last year, the concern was you had Colonial Pipeline, you had jet fuel in it, you had this big drop off in demand for it, and it took a long time to get the jet fuel actually out of the pipeline. And now it's the opposite, right? You may have this sudden summer increase in air travel picking up where now you need to get jet fuel where it needs to be, both through the Colonial Pipeline and to the airports where it's going to be consumed.
Wow, so that should be interesting.
Yeah, it is a sudden pickup, and there definitely is a pent-up demand for air travel, for connectivity, for being able to visit your family, kids to college, everything that goes with that. And even if the international travel is not back, I think we will see things start to really accelerate this summer.
Yeah, let's talk about the pent-up demand some. So as we go through these next few months, how should we be looking at this data? Should we be, in other words, we've kind of gone through this crazy time period where we used to look at data a certain way and the numbers, and now we've kind of threw everything out last year. We're trying to figure out what the indicators are. As things open up, how long will it take us to kind of get a gauge for what is this pent-up demand and people want to go spend money, and what is kind of as we slowly return back to a new normal? Are we talking about another 6 months, 12 months, or will the summertime really be the best time to really gauge where demand might be shifting to, whether it's more driving or flying or whatever that might be?
I think the summer is going to be a turning point in terms of our transparency of really getting a bead on what the data are telling us. Up to this point, we've just had, as we're talking about, the year-on-year comparisons look phenomenal, right? But it's off of a pretty weak base point. Now, and let's contrast this April monthly statistical report, which has actually a really solid underlying picture. It has it evidences very solid leading economic indicator recovery, industrial production coming back, certain parts of the economy, and you see this in headlines concerned about price inflation rising, commodity demand rising, not just for oil, but for metals, for rare earth minerals, for a lot of different things, coming back in a way that has the potential to overheat the economy, actually, on a US and a global basis, where we're stimulating things in a rather blanket sense. It's not very targeted, right? So we're stimulating a lot of economic activity. We're seeing house prices rise. We're seeing lumber shortages. We're seeing supply chain shortages, chip shortages. And this isn't to exaggerate it, right? I mean, these are real impacts as a result of using rather blunt instruments to stimulate an economy that is now suddenly pulling a lot of these goods and economies through supply chains that in some cases are hitting bottlenecks. So for commodity exporting countries around the world, this may be a boon and may help. For consuming nations, the US, Europe, maybe a wash in Asia, depending upon where you are, and seeing China's continuing to accelerate, but maybe Japan doesn't benefit to the same extent given the supply chain issues that have come to pass here. So we'll see how it plays out, but it really is what happens in the next month is going to give us a better indication of what summer driving season looks like in the US and how some of these global issues are really playing out for traction on commodities, oil in particular, but also broader price inflation and its impact on the economy.
Yeah. So one thing last year you brought up several times was how much money we put into the global economy. I can't remember what the trillions of dollars were. Do we feel that now you kind of overheating and it's stimulating? Is that money kind of been deployed, and are we seeing most of the impact of that in the economy now, or we still got ways to figure out until all that money kind of gets to where it's going to go?
Well, I think a lot of it's been deployed and a lot of it is still there to be deployed. The number globally was up to about $20 trillion and counting. And now on top of this, if you look at the Biden administration's proposals and proposed tax increases, you've got a lot of things that flow through from jobs to infrastructure to federal budget that basically would be a lot of spending on top of an economy that's already humming along at a pretty good pace. So if you're going to stimulate further, and this would be stimulative using debt on top of it, that is a concern. And I think that the policymakers are going to have to read the inflation metrics and decide, in reading the tea leaves on this, the challenge is how much of it is one time versus how much of it is likely to be enduring. And right now, it sure looks like with the supply chain issues that we're pushing on something that it has some real hard points to get past.
Yeah, and I just wonder, we talk about, some of this air demand has been cargo, or some of this demand is transporting these goods and services, and those prices, if they get outpriced and people can't afford it, do you see a drop back in demand because people can't afford this stuff? And then does that impact some of these demand numbers, as we move forward?
That is the risk. I mean, some of the work we did on consumer spending over the last year, really looking hard at how the costs of housing and vehicles excluding fuel, but really looking at the cost of the vehicle, its insurance, its maintenance. Those are things that have gone up a lot over the last decade, and they've gone up actually more for lower income households than they have for upper income households. And now, as we go through this, think about some of the headlines that you've seen in the last month. Used car prices going to all-time highs, shortages, supply chain issues with new vehicles, housing prices so going to many areas. That coupled, and part of this may be that people anticipate that eventually interest rates, along with inflation, are likely to rise. But it has, between the pandemic and the low interest rates and maybe a turning point, people have really rushed to buy houses that they haven't in the past. It's really hard to build them and more expensive to build them with shortages of lumber. So these are things that, the vehicle and the house are probably the two largest things that your average household purchases. And if those go up, it becomes almost a threshold, a gating issue of affordability that really is important structurally to the American lifestyle. So we need to see where this heads.
Okay, Dr. Wald, any last questions for Dr. Foreman?
Yeah, I was curious. You talked about deliveries of reformulated gasoline versus conventional gasoline, and maybe you want to just unpack what that means to the listeners, particularly for April, and also maybe what we can expect with the Colonial Pipeline issues.
In plain English, reformulated gasoline tends to be consumed more in urban areas than conventional gasoline pretty much everywhere else, more rural areas. And we've seen a lot more of the strength recently in everywhere else as opposed to the urban areas, which is interesting because you think if people are going back to work and commuting, that would be urban area fuel consumption. But yet the fact that we're seeing it everywhere else suggests that people, one, they're willing to travel, two, that the precursor on the front end of the summer driving season, people are willing, Mother's Day, people drove, right? They went and visited family. And the more we normalize with vaccinations, the more we're likely to see a normalization in just the American lifestyle of, whether it's a weekend or a longer trip, but vacationing and driving in the way that Americans tend to do.
Do you, recently with the Colonial Pipeline issue, the government, I believe, issued a waiver that said that conventional gasoline can be used where instead of reformulated gasoline. Do you anticipate that being, showing up in the being a big enough issue that it will show up in next month's data?
You never say never, but I have a feeling it's isolated enough where, because the pipeline's back in service, we probably aren't going to see with the backfilling of stations something that markedly changes the data. But it'll be interesting as a litmus test to see if it does show up.
Yeah.
I think it really was a system that worked remarkably well. I mean, from an API perspective, where we interact from a state regulatory perspective, both with the member companies and the governments and the agencies, to get those favors to make sure the supply chain is intact. Our fuel subcommittee and our committee that works through emergencies, including this, hurricanes, really came together well and I think was effective in helping the system try to get fuel moved and get the regulatory approvals to do it.
Okay, that is everything. Anything else, Dr. Foreman, before we let you go here today?
I think we've covered most of it. I think on balance, this is a solid report, but we're really, because of this last EIA weekly report, we monitor both our own weekly data and EIA's weekly petroleum status report. And this weekly report, this last one from EIA, is one of the weakest that we've seen since the heart of the pandemic. It was low on demand. It showed the big drop in natural gas liquid production, as we mentioned, and it also had the big drop in crude oil exports, as we mentioned. So again, we need to wait and see. Normally on the demand side, these weekly data have been about 3 times more volatile since the pandemic than they were historically. And we had a reading last week of 17.5 million barrels per day, which is extraordinarily low. Compare that to the April average of 19.6 that we just talked about. For that to come back and show strength, we haven't had since last November 2 consecutive weeks where we've seen that kind of backsliding in demand. And that's what we've seen now for 2 consecutive weeks from EIA's data. API's estimates tend to be a little bit higher on demand right now. So we will see. But fingers crossed, but the economy looks good. And let's hope the demand's coming back with it.
Okay, and just before I let you go, we will not have a show on the 14th of next month. Just a heads up. I don't know when the next report comes out, but we will be off that week. So if
it is the following week.
Okay, good. So you're there you go. So now you know. Okay, thank you again, sir, for coming on, and look forward to talking to you next month.
Great talking with you both. Take care.
Bye.
And once again, that was Dr. Dean Foreman. You can go to api.org at the top right, chief economist, and download the report. It will be out on Thursday. So this is the advanced copy for our listeners. That's what you get. So, yeah. Dr. Wald, anything else before we get out of here today?
Yeah, I thought what he said about the weekly petroleum status report with downgrading over 1 million barrels a day in natural gas liquids was huge. Like, that's a bombshell. And the fact that they knew about this data back in February, but are just kind of processing it now. I mean, is that why we've had so many huge adjustment factors every week? They're trying to work it in by creating these is that it? I mean, wow. Maybe we could get someone from the EIA to come on and discuss this for our listeners, because this is that was a bombshell. Actually, we think that there's a lot less oil being produced. That's basically what was just said.
Do we actually know how much oil is being produced in storage ever?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically we probably know how much is being produced in Alaska. I think we can pretty much depend on on what's coming through. Like they pretty much know because almost all of it I think goes into the Trans-Alaska
Right.
Pipeline. So yeah,
Because
I think that you could pretty much depend on that.
we have Alaska down. Everything
Yeah.
else is basically Iranian numbers. We're not really sure. So
Yeah, OPEC data.
all right, Dr.
I don't
Wall.
think the Canadians lie. I think they're probably pretty good.
Just
I don't know
call,
what's going on in Canada, but I don't think they're lying about their oil production.
just don't call them states. Just don't call them states.
Don't call them states. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Wald, where will you be this week?
Where will I be this week? Well, I am on Bloomberg Opinion this
Very good.
week. I am putting a link to that in the show notes. I have a new column which is titled, I'm just finding out the title now because I don't get to pick my titles. Green Energy Solutions Start at Factory Gates. Ooh, sounds exciting. It's actually about innovative energy solutions and how some industrial companies are basically building their own energy plants to provide them with electricity to produce what it is they're producing. So I talk about this aluminum company called EN Plus Group that basically built its own hydropower in order to manufacture aluminum, and that makes its aluminum like many times greener than aluminum produced by China, which uses coal power.
Mhm.
So, and then there's another company I talk about, a chemical company in Europe that wants to build dedicated nuclear reactors or SMRs, small modular reactors, for to use at its own plants. So yeah, check it out.
All righty. Well, we will be back next week. Everybody next week, and
Yeah.
we will talk to everyone then.